What I observe unfolding along our southern border represents nothing less than the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere, as 7 million Venezuelans flee Maduro's dictatorship, creating a migration tsunami that overwhelms every regional government while flowing inexorably toward American borders that cannot process the humanitarian catastrophe our own policy failures helped create, while organized criminal networks systematically exploit human desperation for unprecedented profit and strategic advantage. The intelligence is clear, crystal clear. Venezuelan refugee flows have destabilized every nation from Colombia to Mexico, while creating systematic pressure on American immigration systems that operate beyond designed capacity. Current intelligence indicates that over 2 million Venezuelans are currently in transit through Central America toward the United States border, while additional millions prepare to flee Venezuela as economic collapse accelerates beyond survivable thresholds. What troubles me most profoundly is the systematic failure of American policy to anticipate the refugee consequences of our sanctions strategy against the Maduro regime. While sanctions were designed to pressure political change in Venezuela, they have instead accelerated economic collapse that forces ordinary Venezuelans to flee their homeland, creating humanitarian pressures that overwhelm regional response capabilities while flowing toward American territories as the ultimate destination. I am analyzing intelligence assessments that detail systematic coordination between Venezuelan criminal organizations, Mexican drug cartels, and human trafficking networks that exploit refugee flows for unprecedented criminal profit. Venezuelan criminal groups, including the Tren de Aragua, operate throughout the migration corridor while coordinating with Mexican cartels to control human smuggling operations that generate billions in illegal revenue. Congressional oversight of border processing capabilities reveals systematic inadequacy of American immigration infrastructure for addressing mass refugee scenarios. Customs and Border Protection facilities operate at 300% of designed capacity while lacking adequate processing personnel, medical facilities, or humanitarian support systems for managing the continuous flow of Venezuelan families seeking asylum protection. The regional spillover effects create systematic destabilization throughout Latin America as host countries face economic pressures that exceed their capacity to provide basic services to refugee populations. Colombia hosts over 2 million Venezuelans, while Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil face similar pressures that strain democratic governance and social stability throughout the region. What makes the Venezuelan refugee crisis particularly challenging is the systematic exploitation by authoritarian actors, including Cuban intelligence, Russian military advisors, and Chinese economic interests that benefit from regional instability, while Venezuelan refugee flows create additional pressure on democratic governments throughout Latin America that face impossible choices between humanitarian obligations and domestic political stability. The economic dimensions of NATO dissolution extend beyond immediate defense spending into comprehensive economic warfare scenarios where Putin gains systematic leverage over European energy supplies, trade relationships, and financial systems that depended on American security guarantees for stable operation. European economics integration requires security and stability. That American alliance withdrawal eliminates, while enabling Putin to manipulate European economic relationships through energy, blackmail, and territorial threats. Intelligence community assessments regarding Venezuelan migration patterns indicate systematic coordination with transnational criminal organizations that view refugee flows as optimal cover for drug trafficking operations, human trafficking, and money laundering activities. Venezuelan refugees face systematic exploitation by criminal networks that force participation in illegal activities while threatening family members remaining in Venezuela. The humanitarian catastrophe dimensions include systematic family separation, child trafficking, sexual exploitation, and medical emergencies that occur throughout the migration corridor from Venezuela to the United States. Venezuelan families face dangerous journey conditions that result in systematic victimization by criminal organizations, environmental hazards, and inadequate humanitarian support throughout transit countries. The policy to coordination challenges between American immigration enforcement and humanitarian assistance create systematic contradictions that prevent effective refugee crisis management, immigration enforcement, priorities, conflict with humanitarian protection, obligations, while asylum processing timelines exceed reasonable expectations for refugee families requiring immediate protection and basic services. The diplomatic implications for American relationships throughout Latin America include systematic tension with regional allies facing similar refugee pressures while lacking adequate American support for refugee assistance programs. Regional governments increasingly view American sanctions against Venezuela as contributing to refugee crises that America does not adequately support through humanitarian assistance or refugee resettlement. The security implications extend beyond border management into comprehensive threats to regional stability as Venezuelan criminal organizations expand operations throughout migration corridors while establishing permanent presence in American cities. Venezuelan gangs, including Tren de Aragua, operate in major American metropolitan areas while maintaining coordination with transnational criminal networks. Mexican government cooperation with American border management faces systematic challenges as Venezuelan refugee flows overwhelm Mexican processing capabilities while creating additional pressure on Mexican social services and infrastructure. Mexican authorities lack adequate resources for managing Venezuelan refugee populations while coordinating with American immigration enforcement. The timeline projections for Venezuelan migration indicate continuing acceleration as economic conditions in Venezuela deteriorate beyond survival thresholds. Intelligence assessments project additional 2 to 3 million Venezuelans will flee their country over the next 2 years, while regional absorption capacity reaches complete saturation, forcing additional migration toward American territories. International coordination for Venezuelan refugee assistance remains inadequate for addressing crisis scale and duration, while donor fatigue reduces international humanitarian funding. United Nations refugee agencies operate with systematic funding shortfalls that prevent adequate humanitarian assistance for Venezuelan refugees throughout the Western Hemisphere. Alternative policy approaches for Venezuelan refugee crisis management require comprehensive coordination between humanitarian assistance, regional development support, and targeted sanctions that distinguish between regime pressure and civilian population protection. Current policy frameworks prove inadequate for addressing mass migration scenarios that require sustained international cooperation and resource commitment. The precedent implications of Venezuelan refugee crisis management extend beyond regional migration into systematic demonstration of American capacity for addressing humanitarian crises that result from authoritarian governance failures. Effective refugee crisis management requires comprehensive approaches that combine humanitarian protection with long-term development support and democratic governance assistance. Regional economic development strategies for addressing Venezuelan migration root causes require sustained American investment in Colombian, Ecuadorian, and other host country infrastructure that enables Venezuelan refugee integration while supporting local community development that benefits both refugees and host populations. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that the Venezuelan refugee crisis represents more than regional migration challenge. It represents a comprehensive test of American capacity for humanitarian leadership, regional cooperation, and policy coordination that addresses both immediate humanitarian needs and long-term development requirements. The decisions made about Venezuelan refugee assistance, border management, and regional cooperation will determine whether America maintains credible leadership for humanitarian crisis response or whether policy failures continue creating humanitarian disasters that exceed regional response capabilities while undermining democratic stability throughout the Western Hemisphere.